I wish the Lord would take me now, his mother sighs, and the apex predator of the New Jersey Mafia immediately hits the floor, paralyzed by a massive panic attack. Tony Soprano can strangle an informant to death without his heart rate spiking, yet he is completely defenseless against the psychological warfare of his own bloodline. He easily survives FBI wiretaps and rival gunmen, but the one assassination attempt that fundamentally breaks him is the hit orchestrated by the woman who gave him life. This is the inescapable curse of generational trauma. Tony inherited a multi-million-dollar crime syndicate, but the true legacy slowly killing him is a toxic inheritance where a mother's resentment proves to be far more lethal than a rival's bullet. To manage this psychological collapse, the mafia boss is driven into an entirely alien battlefield. The psychiatrist's office is architecturally designed to disarm. The leather chair, the muted lighting, and the measured silence are environmental tools meant to deconstruct the defensive barriers of the human mind. For the average patient, this controlled environment fosters vulnerability, leading to gradual behavioral correction and emotional healing. For a man operating at the apex of a criminal syndicate, this exact same space is aggressively repurposed into a tactical briefing room. Tony Soprano does not cross the threshold of Dr. Melfi's office to dismantle his sociopathy. He enters to refine it. Therapy inherently demands introspection, a process that usually forces a confrontation with personal guilt and moral failure. Tony bypasses this moral inventory entirely, focusing his intellect solely on the mechanics of human behavior. He treats psychoanalysis not as a medical intervention, but as an advanced corporate seminar in behavioral manipulation. The clinical vocabulary offered by his doctor is quietly absorbed, categorized, and filed away for future deployment on the streets of New Jersey. He learns the precise psychological levers that govern fear, loyalty, subconscious resentment, and familial obligation. Concepts like clinical depression, generalized anxiety, and impulse control are systematically stripped of their healing intent. Within Tony's mind, they become strategic frameworks used to analyze his subordinates and neutralize his rivals. When a mafia captain exhibits erratic, insubordinate behavior, Tony no longer evaluates it merely as a traditional discipline problem. He identifies the underlying psychological vulnerability, perhaps a fractured ego or a repressed trauma that can be exploited. This newly acquired emotional intelligence makes him a far more lethal administrator than the brute force mob bosses of the previous generation. The dynamic between patient and doctor consciously mimics the Catholic confessional, yet it remains fundamentally hollow at its core. A true confession requires a sincere desire for absolution and a tangible commitment to behavioral change. Tony seeks the psychological relief of the confession without carrying the heavy burden of penance. He unloads the ambient stress of his violent occupation, clears his mental cache, and leaves the office unencumbered by guilt. The psychiatrist unwittingly acts as a high-pressure valve, allowing him to maintain the equilibrium necessary to order executions with a clear, steady mind. The most impenetrable armor Tony wears is not physical, but his carefully cultivated, deeply ingrained sense of victimhood. His recurring melancholic complaint that he arrived at the end of his organization's golden era is a masterclass in self-deception. This historical pessimism allows him to frame his daily struggles as an unfair, insurmountable burden imposed by a declining, ungrateful society. He refuses to view himself as a predator, actively exploiting his community. Instead, he casts himself as a tragic Atlas-like figure, trying to hold together a crumbling empire that no longer respects his sacrifices. This specific narrative shifts the locus of responsibility away from his own calculated choices and onto the abstract forces of history. Self-pity acts as a highly effective, continuous emotional narcotic for the career criminal. It completely numbs the conscience by convincing the mind that it is owed a massive unpaid debt by the universe. When Tony feels marginalized by modern corporate culture, federal law enforcement, or the shifting loyalties of his own blood family, he registers a moral deficit. Every subsequent act of violence, theft, or extortion then becomes an act of justified cosmic compensation. His transgressions stem beyond simple base greed. He fundamentally believes he is balancing an inherently unfair ledger. This internal logic is flawless in its execution, neutralizing the mechanisms of guilt before they can even activate in his brain. The tragedy of the clinical arrangement is the stark asymmetrical flow of information between the two chairs. The therapist operates on an assumption of shared humanity, striving toward a mutual goal of psychological integration and peace. The patient, however, is engaged in a covert, relentless extraction of psychological data. Every probing question asked by the doctor inadvertently provides Tony with a new angle on human weakness. He learns how childhood trauma shapes adult decision-making, and he immediately applies this knowledge to exploit the familial fractures of his enemies. The office becomes a sanitized laboratory where he dissects human fragility for tactical advantage. Clinical depression is a legitimate, debilitating affliction, but within Tony's operational framework, it frequently doubles as camouflage. His panic attacks and depressive episodes are genuine physiological reactions to the extreme, unnatural stress of his lifestyle. However, he quickly learns to utilize these genuine vulnerabilities as a reliable shield against total accountability. When cornered by the severe moral implications of his actions, he instinctively retreats into the safety of his diagnosis. The illness becomes an ironclad alibi, a recognized medical excuse for the systemic destruction he leaves in his wake. Power inherently isolates the individual, and the therapy office brings the sheer, crushing scale of Tony's loneliness into sharp focus. He is surrounded by sycophants, competitors, and dependents, but he exists entirely without peers or equals. The doctor is arguably the only person in his life who does not have a financial or physical stake in his immediate survival. Yet, even in this isolated sanctuary, he cannot be entirely truthful due to the legal realities of his profession. He is forced to dance around admissions of specific crimes, speaking instead in the sanitized language of waste management and vague interpersonal conflicts. The therapeutic alliance is permanently crippled, built on a foundation of necessary omissions and calculated half-truths. Empathy requires the ability to genuinely project oneself into the emotional state of another human being. Through his time in therapy, Tony learns to simulate this empathy perfectly without actually experiencing it. He can expertly mimic the cadence of a caring leader and articulate the pain of his subordinates with convincing sincerity. But this simulation is entirely cognitive, completely lacking any true affective depth or moral weight. He understands exactly how people feel, but he does not fundamentally care that they feel. This weaponized cognitive empathy is the defining trait of the successful psychopath, allowing him to destroy lives while maintaining the posture of a concerned patriarch. To sustain a life of constant violent transgression, the human mind must construct an elaborate, heavily fortified architecture of rationalization. Tony's sessions are essentially routine architectural reviews of this mental structure to ensure its ongoing stability. When a pillar of his justification begins to crack under the weight of a particularly brutal or senseless act, he brings the problem to the clinic. He talks around the issue, framing it as a hypothetical or a business dilemma, until the doctor unknowingly provides a new psychological framing device. Once the structural integrity of his self-deception is fully restored, he confidently returns to the streets. Over time, clinical terminology simply sterilizes the underworld. Bloodshed is reframed as conflict resolution and extortion as resource management. A calculated semantic shift that permanently insulates his ego from the visceral reality of his crimes. Over time, Dr. Melfi's office stops being a sanctuary. It becomes his tactical briefing room. Tony doesn't cross that threshold to dismantle his sociopathy. He goes there to upgrade it. He absorbs clinical words like depression and impulse control and immediately weaponizes them against his rivals on the streets of New Jersey. Therapy doesn't cure the mob boss. It simply creates a more lethal, highly efficient predator. The reduction of his panic attacks does not make him a better man. It merely makes him a more reliable instrument of terror. Therapy effectively removes the internal friction from his criminal operations, streamlining his ability to command. He often performs the role of the diligent, engaged patient to satisfy his own vanity. He reads recommended literature, contemplates philosophical concepts, and genuinely wrestles with abstract ideas of existentialism and history. This intellectual engagement is just another layer of the facade, allowing him to view himself as a cultured, thinking man rather than a street-level thug. The pursuit of psychological insight becomes a narcissist's vanity project, elevating his self-esteem while he entirely ignores the moral rot at his core. The clinical dynamic eventually begins to exert a gravitational pull, threatening to consume the doctor as well. Melfi becomes intellectually and morbidly fascinated by her proximity to such raw, unfiltered, and unapologetic power. Tony senses this fascination immediately and feeds it carefully, offering just enough vulnerability to keep her professionally and personally engaged. He manages the therapist using the exact same principles he uses to manage a difficult politician or a skeptical rival. He identifies her intellectual curiosity as a specific weakness and exploits it to ensure she remains securely in his service. Socrates famously claimed that the unexamined life is not worth living. Tony Soprano presents a terrifying modern counterpoint, the intensely examined life dedicated entirely to the preservation and optimization of evil. He looks deeply into his own psyche, clearly sees the darkness residing there, and consciously chooses to optimize it rather than eradicate it. He maps the rugged terrain of his own mind, only to build better, more impenetrable fortifications against his own conscience. The therapy sessions stand as a grim testament to the fact that understanding one's own trauma does not automatically prevent one from inflicting it upon others. The tragedy of the therapy paradox is that the cure itself becomes the disease's strongest defense mechanism. By medicalizing his malice, Tony ensures that his actions are always viewed through the forgiving lens of pathology rather than the harsh light of morality. If his cruelty is merely a symptom of a deeper psychological wound, then he cannot be held entirely responsible for the collateral damage. This is the ultimate victory of the sociopathic mind, convincing the world and itself that the executioner is actually the primary victim. The confessional booth remains occupied, but the man inside is only listening to the echoes of his own justifications. The traditional mythology of the American mafia places a heavy emphasis on the sanctity of the family, particularly the reverence for the mother figure. This cultural archetype dictates that the matriarch is a source of unconditional protection, an untouchable sanctuary standing in stark contrast to the violence of the streets. Tony Soprano's psychological architecture is built upon the catastrophic inversion of this fundamental expectation. Livia Soprano does not function as a sanctuary. She operates as a psychological black hole that actively consumes the emotional vitality of her offspring. Understanding Tony requires dismantling the myth of the hardened gangster and examining the terrified child raised by a clinical narcissist. Livia's pathology goes beyond simple cruelty. It is defined by a profound, terrifying emptiness. She possesses an innate ability to neutralize joy, manipulating the emotional atmosphere of any room she occupies until it matches her own internal desolation. For a child developing within this environment, the maternal bond is replaced by a constant state of emotional starvation. Tony learns early that affection cannot be earned through merit or obedience, because his mother simply lacks the capacity to generate it. This environment forces him to develop a hypervigilant survival mechanism, constantly scanning his mother's unpredictable moods to avoid psychological devastation. The evolutionary imperative of a mother is the preservation of her genetic lineage. When Livia implicitly sanctions a lethal assault on her own son, she violates the most basic biological contract of human existence. This act of betrayal creates a cognitive dissonance so severe that Tony's mind permanently fractures under its weight. If the woman responsible for his creation actively desires his termination, the entire foundation of human trust is rendered obsolete. He is forced to conclude that love is a fragile, conditional illusion, and that absolute hostility is the natural state of the world. This matriarchal wound dictates the precise nature of his adult relationships. Tony continuously seeks out external validation to fill the void left by his mother's indifference, yet he fundamentally distrusts anyone who offers it. He gravitates toward women who share his mother's volatile, demanding traits, subconsciously attempting to rewrite his childhood trauma through his adult mistresses. These relationships are inherently transactional, defined by dominance, financial control, and eventual discard. He cannot participate in a reciprocal emotional exchange because he was never provided a blueprint for healthy attachment. To compensate for his profound internal insecurity, Tony meticulously constructs the persona of the apex predator. His massive physical frame and capacity for sudden, explosive violence serve as a necessary deterrent against a world he perceives as inherently predatory. The mafia hierarchy provides him with an artificial framework of respect and loyalty that he can enforce through fear. In the absence of unconditional love, commanded obedience becomes the most viable substitute. The title of boss is not just a professional achievement. It is a psychological fortress designed to keep the terrified, unloved child hidden from view. However, the modern psychological burden of maintaining this alpha male facade is entirely unsustainable. The human mind is not equipped to perpetually suppress profound trauma while simultaneously managing a high-stakes, violent criminal enterprise. The pressure builds continuously, requiring immense amounts of cognitive energy just to keep the internal damage compartmentalized. Tony treats his mind like a high-security prison, locking away his grief, fear, and maternal rejection behind heavy steel doors. But the infrastructure of this psychological prison is brittle, entirely dependent on his illusion of absolute control over his environment. The collapse of this masculine architecture is vividly illustrated through the somatic manifestation of his panic attacks. The catalyst for his initial collapse, the sight of wild ducks migrating away from his swimming pool, seems absurdly mundane to the outside observer. Yet, within Tony's fractured psyche, this event triggers a catastrophic emotional cascade. The ducks represent the idealized, cohesive family unit that he desperately craves but knows he is entirely incapable of maintaining. Their departure is not a simple act of nature. It is a visceral reminder of his own fundamental inadequacy as a patriarch. When the mind categorically refuses to process a traumatic realization, the body will forcefully intervene. Tony's fainting spells are physiological circuit breakers, completely shutting down his system to prevent a total psychological rupture. The imposing mob boss collapses to the floor. His physical strength remains intact, yet his emotional carrying capacity has been utterly exceeded. This somatic response completely bypasses his conscious control, humiliating him and shattering his carefully projected image of invulnerability. The panic attack is the absolute rebellion of his suppressed humanity against the monster he has forced himself to become. Traditional masculine conditioning in Tony's socioeconomic bracket provides zero vocabulary for emotional articulation. The culture of the streets views introspection as a fatal weakness, leaving men like Tony stranded when confronted with mental health crises. He cannot label his feelings of abandonment, nor can he properly mourn the maternal love he was denied. Without the language required to process pain, his unresolved trauma ferments into a toxic, generalized depression. This depression is the invisible gravity that dictates his every movement, a heavy, suffocating blanket that he constantly fights to throw off. Because he lacks the tools for emotional communication, violence becomes his primary method of expression. When the internal pressure of his depression threatens to overwhelm him, he externalizes the pain by inflicting it upon others. A sudden outburst of rage against a subordinate is rarely about the stated offense. It is an immediate, necessary release valve for his own psychological agony. By dominating and terrorizing another human being, he temporarily reasserts his illusion of control over the universe. Violence is the only dialect he speaks fluently, a tragic translation of his own unacknowledged suffering. The tragedy of the alpha male archetype is its inherent isolation. A leader who rules exclusively through fear and dominance can never reveal a moment of hesitation or vulnerability. Tony must constantly project certainty, even as his internal world is collapsing into absolute chaos. He surrounds himself with a crew of sycophants and killers who rely on his strength for their own survival, leaving him without a single authentic confidant. The crown he wears is incredibly heavy, forged from the collective expectations of the men who secretly wait for him to fail. His attempts to self-medicate this isolation often exacerbate the underlying damage. His compulsive gambling, chronic infidelity, and gluttony are desperate, temporary attempts to stimulate a dopamine response in a brain deadened by depression. These vices offer a fleeting sense of vitality, a momentary distraction from the crushing emptiness he inherited from Livia. But the relief is entirely transient, requiring increasingly extreme behavior to achieve the same numbing effect. He is caught in a destructive cycle of consumption, trying to fill a maternal void that is mathematically infinite. Ultimately, Tony's psychological collapse is an inevitability programmed into his system from childhood. The therapy sessions, the medication, and the temporary distractions are merely delaying tactics against an oncoming existential crisis. He operates under the delusion that he can outsmart his own trauma through sheer force of will and intelligence. But the matriarchal wound is not a problem to be solved. It is a permanent amputation of his capacity for empathy and trust. The man who demands absolute loyalty from his subordinates is forever defined by the mother who offered him none. The most pervasive delusion harbored by the career criminal is the belief in a localized moral quarantine. Tony operates under the desperate assumption that the violence he orchestrates in the streets can be permanently halted at the threshold of his own front door. He views his suburban home as a sterile, impenetrable sanctuary, explicitly distinct from the blood-soaked reality of his profession. This geographical segregation of morality is his primary psychological defense against the overwhelming guilt of his actions. He convinces himself that as long as his family remains physically untouched by the violence, his soul remains partially salvageable. This conceptual firewall between the professional monster and the domestic patriarch is fundamentally flawed. Psychology does not recognize property lines or suburban zoning laws. Trauma and moral decay are highly contagious ambient conditions. The wealth that constructs his fortress is inextricably saturated with the suffering of its victims, and this origin cannot be simply washed away. The Soprano household is not a sanctuary at all, but rather a pressurized containment unit, slowly filling with toxic, unacknowledged guilt. The infection does not arrive through the front door with a gun. It seeps through the floorboards as a slow, corrosive atmospheric rot. To maintain the illusion of domestic purity, Tony essentially commodifies his own conscience. He treats his role as the primary financial provider not as a basic familial duty, but as a mechanism for total moral absolution. The procurement of extreme excess wealth becomes the singular justification for the predatory nature of his existence. He operates on a distorted ethical ledger where the sheer volume of his financial contribution mathematically cancels out the brutality of its acquisition. If his family lacks for no material comfort, he reasons, then his methodology is retroactively validated by the results. This transactional dynamic forms the diseased bedrock of his marriage to Carmela. Tony utilizes high-end real estate, luxury vehicles, and heavy gold jewelry not as expressions of romantic love, but as high-priced hush money. Every time his infidelity or his violence threatens to rupture the fragile peace of their home, he initiates a financial transaction. He effectively purchases her continued complicity, transforming their marital vows into an ongoing, unspoken non-disclosure agreement. The marriage ceases to be an emotional partnership and devolves into a complex ecosystem of mutual extortion and strategic blindness. Carmela's role in this psychological ecosystem is critical, as she is neither a captive nor an entirely innocent bystander. She actively participates in the commodification of their relationship, learning exactly how to extract the maximum material penalty for her husband's transgressions. She consciously compartmentalizes the origins of her wealth, choosing the comfort of her lifestyle over the demands of a rigorous conscience. This willful ignorance is an exhausting cognitive burden, requiring constant, active suppression of her own fundamental decency. Her psychological survival depends entirely on never looking too closely at the hands that feed her. The tragedy of their union is the profound, suffocating silence that governs it. The truth of Tony's existence is the central dominating fact of their lives, yet it is the one subject that can never be explicitly addressed. They communicate almost entirely in subtext, carefully navigating around the massive bleeding reality of the mafia. This forced omission creates an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia and underlying resentment within the home. The family dinner table, traditionally a site of connection, becomes a theater of elaborate, exhausting denial, where everyone plays their assigned roles perfectly. The most devastating consequence of this moral rot is its inevitable generational transmission. Tony's stated purpose for his criminality is the protection and elevation of his children. Yet his very presence acts as a powerful psychological neurotoxin. He assumes that his physical dominance and financial resources act as an impermeable shield for his bloodline. He fails to understand that children do not simply inherit wealth, they absorb the unstated emotional frequencies of their environment. The psychological damage he inflicts upon AJ and Meadow is far more severe than any physical threat he protects them from. AJ Soprano is perhaps the most tragic casualty of Tony's overwhelming predatory shadow. The boy inherits the genetic predisposition for severe clinical depression and catastrophic panic, but he receives absolutely none of his father's survival instincts. He is entirely unequipped for the brutal, demanding world his father effortlessly dominates. Tony projects a suffocating aura of hypermasculinity that AJ knows he can never emulate, leading to a profound, paralyzing sense of inadequacy. The boy is crushed under the weight of an unachievable expectation before he even has a chance to form his own identity. This crushing inadequacy manifests not as rebellion, but as a profound, impenetrable lethargy. AJ's academic failure and chronic lack of motivation are not simple acts of laziness. They are symptoms of a deep existential paralysis. He intuitively understands that the foundation of his family's comfort is fundamentally evil, but he lacks the courage or the framework to dismantle it. His depression is a retreat from a reality that terrifies him, a subconscious refusal to participate in the legacy he is supposed to inherit. He becomes a hollow vessel, drained of ambition by the toxic environment his father constructed. Tony views his son's weakness with a volatile mixture of profound disappointment and unacknowledged guilt. He recognizes his own internal darkness reflected in AJ, stripped of the operational competence that makes his own life functional. His attempts to harden the boy through intimidation or forced discipline only exacerbate the underlying psychological damage. Tony cannot fix his son, because he fundamentally lacks the emotional vocabulary required to heal. He only knows how to conquer. The father's immense power is entirely useless when confronted with the quiet, collapsing mind of his own child. Soprano presents a vastly different but equally tragic adaptation to the family disease. Blessed with high intelligence and extreme academic capability, she possesses the necessary tools to completely escape the gravitational pull of her father's world. Initially, she uses her intellect to challenge the hypocrisy of her parents, identifying the moral contradictions that Carmela so desperately tries to hide. She represents the possibility of a clean break, a chance for the bloodline to purify itself through education and distance. However, the psychological grip of the family ecosystem proves far more insidious than simple physical proximity. As she matures, Meadow's intellect is slowly co-opted by the necessity of self-preservation. To truly condemn her father's actions would require completely dismantling her own identity and relinquishing the extreme privilege that funds her existence. Faced with this terrifying prospect, she begins to weaponize her education to defend the indefensible. She utilizes complex sociological theories, historical grievances, and academic jargon to construct elaborate justifications for organized crime. The Ivy League education meant to liberate her instead provides her with a more sophisticated vocabulary for rationalizing murder. This process represents the ultimate corruption of her moral compass. She convinces herself that her father is not a violent predator, but a victim of systemic anti-Italian discrimination and an unfair federal justice system. This intellectualization of evil is a brilliant, devastating defense mechanism that allows her to maintain a relationship with her father without completely destroying her own self-image. She learns to view the blood on the money through the sterile, detached lens of sociology, entirely stripping it of its human cost. The virus successfully mutates, adapting to her intelligence and turning her greatest strength into her most fatal flaw. The evolution of Meadow is perhaps Tony's most complete unspoken victory and simultaneously his greatest failure as a parent. He successfully protected her physical safety, but he entirely consumed her moral autonomy. She becomes a high-functioning apologist for a system that destroys lives, seamlessly integrating her family's criminality into a progressive, modern worldview. She represents the successful mainstreaming of the Soprano pathology, taking the brutal violence of the streets and dressing it in the respectable clothing of corporate law. The generational trauma does not end with her. It merely changes its operational parameters to survive in a new environment. The tragedy of the genetic virus is that there is no identifiable point of quarantine. Tony cannot separate the money from the blood, and he cannot separate his children from his own psychological ruin. The wealth he accumulated to build a fortress has instead built a luxurious, inescapable mausoleum for their collective morality. The Soprano household stands as a monument to the terrifying reality that power cannot inoculate a family against the consequences of its own actions. The rot always moves from the inside out, silently consuming the foundation long before the walls finally collapse. The concept of legacy is the final, desperate refuge for a man who knows his soul is fundamentally compromised. For years, Christopher Moltisanti served as the designated vessel for Tony's professional immortality. The nephew was not merely an underling, he He was a carefully cultivated psychological insurance policy against the inevitability of death or federal incarceration. Tony invested immense emotional capital into this surrogate son, hoping to retroactively validate his own violent life by successfully passing the torch. The expectation was that Christopher would eventually absorb the physical risks of leadership, allowing the aging boss a comfortable, insulated twilight. This mentorship was inherently poisoned from its inception, built on a foundation of demanded loyalty rather than genuine, nurturing guidance. Tony required an heir who possessed his own predatory instincts but lacked his psychological burdens, an impossible contradiction. He demanded total subservience, while simultaneously demanding the type of independent ruthlessness required to manage a criminal empire. This paradoxical pressure cooker inevitably forced Christopher to seek external chemical relief. The introduction of heroin into the dynamic was not an anomaly, but a direct consequence of the crushing weight of Tony's expectations. Addiction introduces a chaotic, uncontrollable variable into a system that relies entirely on absolute, rigid control. To a sociopathic administrator like Tony, an addict is fundamentally terrifying because their primary loyalty is to the substance, not the boss. The disease strips away the leverage of fear and financial reward that Tony utilizes to govern his subordinates. He views Christopher's addiction not as a medical tragedy, but as a severe personal insult and an operational liability. The empathy he occasionally simulates for his nephew's struggle is continually overshadowed by a seething narcissistic resentment. The culmination of this toxic dynamic occurs in the suffocating darkness of a wrecked SUV. Following the violent rollover, the environment is stripped of all mafia mythology, leaving only the raw, immediate reality of survival. A standard human psychological response to such trauma involves a sudden, overwhelming surge of protective adrenaline toward the injured passenger. Tony, however, experiences a terrifying moment of supreme detached clarity. The adrenaline does not trigger a rescue instinct. It activates a hyper-rational, cold-blooded risk assessment. He looks at the mangled vehicle, the destroyed baby seat in the rear, and the bleeding, helpless man beside him. When Christopher weakly confesses that he will never pass a drug test, he unwittingly presents his uncle with an administrative solution. The decision to eliminate his nephew is formulated in a fraction of a second, completely devoid of the performative anger that usually accompanies Tony's violence. There is no ideological monologue, no assertion of dominance, and no adherence to the formal rules of the underworld. It is an execution born entirely of supreme sociopathic convenience. The physical mechanics of the murder are deeply disturbing in their quiet, agonizing intimacy. Tony does not use a firearm or a garrote. He uses his own bare hands to pinch shut the nose of a man gasping for breath on his own blood. This method requires a sustained physical connection to the victim, forcing Tony to directly observe the life draining from his nephew's eyes. Yet the expression on the boss's face remains remarkably vacant, registering the event as a necessary chore rather than a profound moral violation. He is pruning a diseased branch from his family tree to protect the integrity of the main trunk. By extinguishing the life of his own blood, Tony decisively crosses a moral Rubicon from which there is zero possibility of return. The act completely incinerates the foundational myth that his criminality is justified by the protection of his family. He weaponizes his physical dominance against the very person he swore to mentor, prioritizing his own legal and operational security above human life. The family has ceased to be a sanctuary and has officially become a liability matrix. Anyone who threatens the equilibrium of the boss, regardless of genetic proximity, is subject to immediate liquidation. The horror of the act is compounded by the sheer absence of immediate remorse. As he waits for the emergency services to arrive, Tony does not experience the crushing weight of a guilty conscience. Instead, he begins the immediate, necessary construction of a post-murder propaganda campaign within his own mind. He understands intuitively that his ego cannot survive the raw, unfiltered truth of what he has just done. The mind of a predator must immediately synthesize an alternative reality where the predatory act is framed as a moral necessity. He seizes upon the image of a crushed tree branch resting where Christopher's infant daughter would have been sitting. This visual detail becomes the cornerstone of his internal rationalization, the psychological lever he uses to completely flip the moral narrative. He begins to actively convince himself that the murder was not an act of selfish self-preservation, but a profound tragic mercy killing. He adopts the posture of a dark savior, stepping in to eliminate an unstable addict before the disease could destroy an innocent child. The executioner successfully rebrands himself as a silent, misunderstood guardian. This process of self-brainwashing is executed with terrifying efficiency. Within days, the manufactured narrative entirely overwrites the factual reality in Tony's conscious memory. He genuinely believes his own lie, insulated by the sociopathic ability to sever the connection between action and consequence. This represents the absolute pinnacle of self-deception, a psychological gymnastics routine that borders on total psychosis. He commits the ultimate betrayal and emerges from it feeling entirely vindicated by his own twisted ethical code. The psychological fallout of the murder manifests not as guilt, but as a profound, isolating irritation with the rest of humanity. As the family gathers to mourn Christopher, Tony is forced to navigate a sea of genuine grief that he finds completely repulsive. The tears of Christopher's widow and the eulogies of his soldiers feel like an aggressive affront to the secret truth Tony harbors. He despises their sadness because it serves as an unwelcome reminder of the normal human empathy he has entirely eradicated from his own soul. He is alienated by their humanity. He desperately seeks external validation for his relief, subtly attempting to goad others into admitting that the world is better off without the addict. He wants his associates to share his cold calculus, to validate the horrific equation he balanced in the front seat of that SUV. When they refuse to abandon their grief, his isolation becomes absolute and impenetrable. He is the only man in the room who understands the true nature of the universe he has created. It is a universe where life is entirely commodified, and love is merely a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. This profound emotional void is perhaps the most accurate autopsy of Tony Soprano's soul. The capacity for empathy, a muscle that had been steadily atrophying for decades, is now definitively dead. He views the people in his life not as autonomous beings with inherent value, but purely as assets on a balance sheet. When an asset depreciates beyond its utility, it is violently liquidated without a second thought. The tragedy is no longer about the people he kills. It is about the absolute chilling emptiness of the man who survives them. The murder of Christopher destroys the last remaining tether connecting Tony to his own past and his potential future. The nephew was the final link to the early foundational days of his rise to power, a repository for shared memories and genuine, albeit toxic, affection. By eliminating him, Tony burns the bridge to his own history, ensuring that his legacy will be defined solely by paranoia and isolation. He secures his physical freedom, but guarantees his permanent psychological, solitary confinement. The throne is finally secure, but it sits in the center of an emotional graveyard. In the aftermath, the daily operations of the mafia continue, but the spiritual core of the enterprise is permanently hollowed out. Tony goes through the motions of leadership, collecting envelopes and issuing orders, but the underlying motivation is entirely extinguished. He's no longer building an empire for a successor. He is simply maintaining a machine out of pure mechanical habit. The survival instinct has consumed every other aspect of his personality, leaving behind a highly functioning, remarkably dangerous, empty shell. The executive function remains, but the humanity has been permanently extinguished. The architecture of a suburban diner is explicitly designed for comfort, predictability, and communal ease. The brightly lit booths, the laminated menus, and the hum of casual conversation offer a distinctly American promise of safe, unchallenging domesticity. For a man who has spent a lifetime navigating the treacherous, blood-soaked currents of the underworld, this environment should theoretically offer a brief psychological reprieve. Yet as Tony Soprano sits in the booth at Holston's, the mundane setting undergoes a terrifying psychological inversion. The bright lighting does not offer comfort. It merely eliminates the shadows where a predator might hide, leaving him feeling completely exposed. The nervous system of a career criminal is fundamentally rewired by decades of continuous trauma, violence, and betrayal. Normal physiological baseline states of relaxation are entirely eradicated, replaced by a permanent humming frequency of hypervigilance. Tony's brain no longer processes sensory information the way a civilian mind does. A door opening, a stranger glancing over a menu, or the sudden movement of a waitress are not neutral events. They are immediately categorized through a rapid, involuntary threat assessment matrix that he can never turn off. This constant operational readiness requires a massive, unsustainable expenditure of cognitive energy. Every waking moment is consumed by the subconscious calculation of angles, exits, and sight lines. He cannot simply consume a meal. He must strategically position himself facing the entrance, essentially treating a family dinner as a tactical military deployment. The physical toll of this psychological posture is immense, contributing directly to his obesity, his fatigue, and his somatic collapses. The body is effectively cannibalizing itself to fund the exhaustive security apparatus of the mind. The arrival of Carmela at the table highlights the hollow, tragic nature of his lifelong struggle for dominance. They exchange mundane pleasantries, but the airspace between them is thick with the unsaid history of their moral compromises. She is the beneficiary of his violence. Sitting comfortably in the spoils of a war she has spent decades pretending not to notice. Yet, even in her presence, Tony remains fundamentally alone within the impenetrable fortress of his own paranoia. He cannot articulate his terror to her, because doing so would shatter the illusion of control that anchors their entire marriage. AJ joins them shortly after, dragging the crushing weight of the family's generational trauma into the booth. The boy's mere existence serves as a living, breathing indictment of Tony's ultimate failure as a patriarch. Tony looks at his son and sees the genetic virus of depression fully manifested, stripped of any compensatory street-level toughness. They share a basket of onion rings, engaging in a hollow communion that desperately attempts to simulate normal family life. It is a pantomime of domestic tranquility, performed by people whose moral foundations have completely rotted away. The true psychological anchor of this final sequence is the recurring sound of the door chime. For a normal patron, the bell is simply background noise, signaling the arrival of a new customer seeking ice cream. For Tony, it operates as a severe Pavlovian trigger, instantly demanding his full terrified attention. Every time the bell rings, his eyes involuntarily dart upward, scanning the newcomer with cold, calculating suspicion. He is locked in a biological prison, his central nervous system entirely at the mercy of a small mechanical sound. This repetitive physical motion, the sudden upward glance, is the visual manifestation of his absolute existential dread. He is scanning the crowd for the inevitable consequence of his own actions, knowing mathematically that his luck is finite. The patron in the members-only jacket is not necessarily a definitive assassin. He is the embodiment of the ubiquitous, faceless threat that Tony has spent his life generating. Every person he extorted, every family he ruined, and every subordinate he betrayed has a statistical probability of walking through that door. The diner is crowded with the invisible ghosts of his own making. The tension in the room is not generated by an active, visible threat, but by the overwhelming anticipation of violence. This is the ultimate psychological tax levied on the apex predator of the criminal ecosystem. He spent his entire adulthood instilling fear in others, utilizing extreme unpredictability as his primary weapon of governance. Now that same unpredictable terror is turned completely inward, holding him hostage in a brightly lit family restaurant. The man who dictated the terms of life and death for an entire city is reduced to simply waiting for the axe to fall. The jukebox plays a nostalgic anthem, attempting to anchor the scene in a comforting sense of shared Americana. Yet this auditory backdrop only serves to highlight the severe cognitive dissonance of Tony's shattered reality. He cannot participate in the shared cultural experience of the music because his mental bandwidth is entirely consumed by survival. The simple act of waiting for his daughter to walk through the door becomes a moment of suspended, agonizing vulnerability. He is fundamentally alienated from the human experience, a terrified ghost haunting the perimeter of his own life. The intense debate surrounding the sudden cut to black often misses the profound philosophical point. The abrupt plunge into silent darkness is not a narrative cliffhanger. It is a definitive existential sentence. Whether Tony physically survives that dinner is immaterial. He is condemned to live permanently in the agonizing microsecond before the trigger is pulled, his nervous system forever held hostage by the mundane sound of a door chime. The physical outcome is irrelevant because the psychological destruction is already absolute. Ultimately, the financial empire will inevitably dissipate, leaving behind only the generational trauma echoing through his fractured family. The screen cuts to black because the man's conscience has finally gone completely dark.